This is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. Last time we began a very preliminary lecture on Kant. We're now going to cut to the heart of things in Kant. What we've talked about last time is basically Kant's pre-critical period. But at some point in this pre-critical period, Kant becomes convinced that there is a divorce between the supersensible realm of metaphysics and the realm of science and space-time. Okay, so he begins to go after the Leibnizian notion that perception is just confused conception. He starts to see these as two quite different things, and he's now going after, or beginning to doubt, the equation of reason giving with cause giving. To say that X causes Y is not to say that X is a reason for Y. Reason and cause are different. They show up in different places epistemologically. And so he reaches the point now of subjecting his earlier work, and indeed the work of the tradition, to critique. So now we're standing in the, let's say, the 1780s. And his problems that he's inheriting are what is the nature and scope of metaphysics? I mean, certainly we have in Leibniz a very strong tradition of metaphysics, Christian Wolff, who followed at Königsberg, a very strong tradition of metaphysics in the German rationalist tradition. And yet over on the British Isles, we have Hume basically saying that metaphysics is nonsense, you know. If you bring me a book with metaphysical assertions in it, I'll find a good fire to throw the book on, right? So what is the nature and scope of metaphysics? How is it that we can have real knowledge of the natural world? So the epistemological question, right? So we have the question of the metaphysical question, epistemological questions, and not just of the natural world. How can we have real knowledge of mathematics, geometry? So Kant says that he has three fundamental questions, you know. What can I know? Epistemological question. What ought I to do? The moral question. And of course, that's the subject of the second critique. What can I know is the subject of the first critique, critique of pure reason. And what may I hope for, which is more or less the subject of the third critique, the critique of judgment. Now, what Kant says is he's formulating and propounding a Copernican revolution in philosophy. And of course, you remember that Copernicus said, hey, maybe the sun doesn't go around the earth, maybe the earth goes around the sun, and actually it's much more consistent in a simpler theory. It's consistent with our data, and it's simpler than the other view that somehow everything goes around the earth. So Kant is asking this. I mean, everybody thinks, and of course Locke thinks, and Descartes in his own way, but certainly the British empiricists think, and that's supposed to be ahead, okay, that there's something out in the world, and that, you know, this thing out in the world somehow impresses itself upon the mind. Of course, I'm drawing a brain there. Well, it's hard to draw a mind, means it's not in space. But anyway, somehow in the mind you have an impression of the thing out here. And so that there is a copy in the mind of the thing out there. That's kind of the inherited view. And what Kant compares this to is basically the geocentric hypothesis. Right? But what if the heliocentric hypothesis is correct? And what if instead of the mind revolving around the thing, right? So the thing is there and the mind is getting different views of it. What if the thing revolves around the mind? What if the mind is at the center of things, right? While Kant claimed that adherents of traditional metaphysics of the West thought that the mind was purely passive to objects and thus metaphorically revolved around them. Kant is suggesting that the mind is really actively organizing experience. Objects thus revolve around the mind. Now, very early in the Critique of Pure Reason, he makes some distinctions. He distinguishes the Erläuterungsurteil from the Erweiterungsurteil. That is the analytic and the synthetic judgment. In the analytic and synthetic judgment, he makes this distinction in order to clean up the problem inherited from Leibniz of the predicate in notion theory. He says that Leibniz, with the predicate in notion theory, that the predicate, anything that can be said truly of a thing, is contained in the notion of the thing. That is true, but only of analytical judgments. So he distinguishes an analytical judgment from a synthetic judgment. An analytical judgment is one in which truly the predicate is included, right, within the subject. So that's an analytical judgment. But that is true because of meaning, Kant says. In matters of the world, like we would say that the house across the street is white, we have what's called a synthetic judgment. It's an Erweiterungsurteil. It's making wider judgment. It's an amplitive judgment. So in a synthetic judgment, the predicate is not included within the subject. It adds to the subject. Okay? So in the analytical judgment, the concept of the predicate is included in the concept of the subject. In the synthetic judgment, the concept of the predicate is not included within the concept of the subject. So what basically he's trying to do is he's trying to say, I need to clear up this morass here, predicate and notion, and there's a fundamental distinction here between kinds of judgments. And he's basically got Hume in his ears here, because he'd read Hume, who he claimed woke him from his dogmatic slumbers. And Hume, of course, had made a sharp distinction between relations, matters of fact, and relations of ideas. So while a synthetic and an analytic judgment is a semantic distinction, right? Here the meaning of this is contained in that. Here the meaning of this is not contained in that. He also has the notion of an a priori judgment over and against an a posteriori judgment. Posteriori. So an a priori judgment is one made in advance of empirical experience, and an a posteriori judgment is one made on the basis of empirical experience. And this is an epistemological judgment. So now, if you think about it, we have analytic. We've got four ways. Now here's our semantic categories up here, and our epistemological over here, right? Right? So we have an a priori analytic judgment, right? And of the a priori analytic judgment, he says that these are relations of ideas. This is, we know that a bachelor is an unmarried male prior to experience. Why? Because knowing that is not something, because the meaning of unmarried male is included within the notion of bachelor. We have a posteriori, so these are kind of, this would be our, I'm going to use different language here, kind of our conceptual truths, a priori analytic. A posteriori synthetic is our empirical truths. A priori, or a posteriori analytic truths, he didn't think there were any, so we leave that one out. Actually, I think there are some. And Kripke, of course, very famously, Saul Kripke argued that there are such things. But his basic question is this: are there synthetic a priori judgments? Synthetic a priori judgments would be judgments about the metaphysical structure of reality that can be had independent of experience. What things can we know about the ultimate constitution of the universe independent of experience? Now, Leibniz thought this was a very big class, right? All kinds of things could be known. Kant is much more circumspect with regard to how big that class is. So I am Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. We'll be back next time with more on Kant. We'll talk about Kant in the first critique, a little bit on the second critique, very briefly on the third critique, on to Hegel, and from there on, we'll see what else happens. Thank you very much for joining us today.